Okay, so welcome to Othello Act 3, Scene 3, Part 1. I'm going to look at this scene in two separate parts, just to warn you, there is another video after this one. And as before, I would like you to make a Cornell note-taking sheet as you're watching the video. So step one for that is you write your title at the top and then you take notes while watching the video. Make sure you're bullet pointing key ideas, key words, key quotations that you want to remember. Don't just copy down everything I say, but make sure that you're pausing the video and selecting the important details. Step 2 is to reread your notes and extract any keywords and questions that you want to remember for later. And step 3, after watching the video, perhaps the next day, go back to your notes and use your keywords to write a summary of the topic. And as I've said before, that's going to help to embed your knowledge in the long-term memory. Okay, so where are we in the play? Well, we've been through the exposition where Iago and Rodrigo waken up Brabantio, telling him that Othello and Desdemona have eloped. We've seen how Iago manipulates Rodrigo and how that manipulation is foreshadowing his increasing control over Othello and over Cassio. We've seen how Iago presents an honest face to Othello, who's called before the Duke to lead the Venetian force against Cyprus. So that scene is really reinforcing how trusted Othello is by the Venetian hierarchy. However, at the same time, how he's separated from them as well, which is symbolised by Brabantio's irritation, anger, that he's forced to accept the marriage between Othello and Desdemona. So there's a sense that Othello is allowed to lead the army to protect the country, but he's not allowed to marry into the hierarchy. So we could really question the double standards of Venetian society at the time and reflect on what Shakespeare was then saying about the double standards in Jacobean society. So Desdemona appears on stage and she wants to travel to Cyprus too. Then we've got the rising action, which is really exploring Othello's insecurities, how they can be exploited by Iago. So we have the storm, a symbol of chaos. We have some witty repartee between Iago and Desdemona, which on the one hand could show Desdemona's confidence in public, her ability to flirt with others. On the other hand, could show her naivety, that she's really leaving herself open to some difficult questions there about her relationship with other men. After that, we've seen the feast, where Cassio becomes drunk, he attacks another person, and then he is demoted. So really with that fight, the main action of the play starts and Iago's plan starts to come together. We saw in the last video, Act 3 Scene 1 and Act 3 Scene 2, how Cassio tries to speak to Desdemona alone and Iago continues to extend his influence over all the characters. In Act 3 Scene 2 we see that Othello still has absolute control over Cyprus. Even the day after his marriage he's going around and checking the fortifications. So now we're here in Act 3 Scene 3, really almost at the climax of the play, which is the point where deception and duplicity dominate, whilst the destructive power of jealousy becomes clear. Now these ideas in the larger font are really the key phrases that I want you to take away, and make sure that you learn these and you're dropping them into your essays. So for the falling action, we'll see the combination of Othello's increasing corruption and Iago's lust for power plunge society into chaos and disorder. That's the ripples from this kind of personal decision that Othello is going to distrust his wife to the political and the social implications of that. And finally we see the denouement, which is the debasement of previously honourable emotions is now irreversible, whilst others proceed to attempt to restore order and justice. Okay, but we'll talk about those in later lessons. So what actually happens then in Act 3 Scene 3? Well, I hope you have your copy of the play in front of you. Pause the video and then check along with the text to make sure that you're following it. So firstly, Desdemona, Cassio and Emilia enter. Desdemona is promising to help Cassio. And Desdemona and Emilia speak of the honesty of Iago, Cassio and Othello. We hear Desdemona say, "I shall rather die than give thy cause away." Now, this is not because she's in love with Cassio, which is what Othello starts to believe, but it reveals her honesty, her naivety, her belief that all of the men in her life have integrity, and that they should all come to trust each other. She's treating Cassio like a brother, I suppose, at this point in the play. Then Othello and Iago arrive. We assume that Iago has stage managed this arrival because he knew the conversation was going to happen. So Othello and Iago arrive, and seeing them, Cassio slips away. Now Cassio's probably embarrassed to be caught speaking to Desdemona. He probably isn't ready to face Othello at this point. However, Iago opportunistically employs this to voice his suspicions. So Iago says, "Ha, I like not that." And he says it as a bit of a throwaway comment, the kind of thing that you wouldn't really listen to, that you'd just ignore. But Othello really jumps on this and says, "What do you mean by that? You know, why did you say that? What's wrong with Cassio talking to Desdemona?" So we can see that Iago is starting to sow the seeds of doubt, of suspicion in Othello's mind. Desdemona immediately tells Othello that Cassio requires his help. She's very open about this, very upfront about it, which makes us think that she has no ulterior motives. However, for Othello, it seems that Desdemona is quite impatient to help the person perhaps that she really loves. So Othello tries to ignore this, but Desdemona determinedly pursues the topic. Othello gives in, and then he requests a bit of time alone, which is slightly worrying for a newly married couple. Desdemona and Emilia leave, and we can see that they follow the instructions of the men at this point in the play. They don't question it, they don't debate it, they just do as they're told, as a stereotypical Jacobean woman should. After they have left, Othello's tone suddenly changes. So most actors who are playing these lines sound quite angry, quite frustrated. There's an explosion of emotion at this point in the play. So he says, "Excellent wretch, when I love thee not, chaos is come again." We'll come back to these lines later, but essentially what he is saying is that he's starting to despise Desdemona, but he loves her at the same time, but his love for her is starting to be a little bit shaky, it's starting to wane. Then Iago uses this to his advantage, picking up on everything that Othello says and turning it around so that Othello starts to become more and more upset about his relationship with Desdemona. And Othello then speaks of the monster in thy thought. So by this he means the monster that Iago's thinking about, and he accuses Iago of having suspicions. All of this is obviously revealing Othello's growing jealousy of Desdemona and Cassio. And that, as we've talked about in lessons before, reveals Othello's self-consciousness because of his race, because of his otherness within the play. He assumes that Desdemona is naturally going to become tired of him and fall in love with a white person. Now, from a modern perspective, that's quite an abhorrent thing to think. However, we can understand from the xenophobic atmosphere that we've seen in Act 1 that this is something that Othello has absorbed from the culture around him. So essentially, it's the external pressures on the tragic hero that we're looking at this point. After that, Iago pretends to be loyal, and he appears to defend Cassio, but in doing so he stokes the fire of Othello's suspicions even further. And Othello's language starts to change. It's really interesting at this point of the play. He starts echoing words that Iago has used in Act 1, Scene 1. So, for example, zounds and monster start to appear in Othello's diction. Then Othello insists that he wants proof of Desdemona's infidelity. Iago responds by asking him to watch her closely. And there's a real play on the idea of proof and what constitutes good proof. And for Othello, this is kind of hard fact, something that you can see, something that you can sense. So Iago provides him with that. He says, "Watch your wife, watch her talking to Cassio." And then Iago echoes the resonant line from Act 1, Scene 3, "She did deceive her father." Now, earlier on, Brabantio said that she did deceive her father and may thee. And so Othello starts to absorb this idea from several different characters in the play, and it starts to grow in his mind, and his passion for Desdemona becomes corrected. Zooming in on Cassio then, we see at the start of the scene that he engages in some very polite flattery of Desdemona, which is completely consistent with his earlier comments. So he calls her a bounteous, meaning generous, madam, which echoes earlier comments about her exquisite qualities, her divine character, and her perfection. He's very trusting. He unquestioningly follows Iago's advice, which is to seek the help of Desdemona. Although he does doubt as well, he doubts Othello's trust in him, so he believes that Othello will forget my love and service. So he himself is quite self-conscious here. Looking at Desdemona then, she's a very open and honest character in this scene. She says, I will do all my abilities in thy behalf. She says she's going to help Cassio as much as she can, partly because she knows that Cassio and Othello have been close before. She knows that Cassio is a good right-hand man in the army, and so she probably wants to help Cassio so that she can also help Othello at the same time. Ironically, she's very mistaken in this scene, especially when she's talking about Iago. She describes him as an honest fellow, and the repetition of this adjective honest to describe Iago throughout the play becomes more and more ironic as the play progresses. We also see here a repetition of the idea of the precarious foundations of the marriage between Desdemona and Othello. So she seems very confident. She says, I'll talk him out of patience, as in, I'll speak to Othello so much about you, I'll ask him so often to reinstate you in your position in the army, that he will lose his patience. Now, it's extremely naive. She doesn't know what Othello's character will be like when he does lose his patience. And as we see later in the play, and as is hinted at in this scene, when he loses patience, he becomes a very violent character. So what we see here is that she doesn't actually know the man that she's married very well. And this links back to Act 1, where Othello talks about the courtship, and he says, she loved me for the dangers I had passed, and I loved her that she did pity them. So essentially what he's saying there is that she loved me because of the incredible stories that I've told, because of my heroism. Not a real life scenario to get to know someone in. And I loved her that she did pity them. So he's not actually listened too much about her life, and she knows nothing about his life outside of the army. So really there's a lack of self-knowledge, but also knowledge of the other person here. Finally, in this scene, she's very determined, she's very confident in her love, and in this way Shakespeare challenges stereotypes of femininity. And he's done this with Lady Macbeth as well. Shakespeare often shows very strong characters on the stage. However, we could question whether Shakespeare thinks that these strong female characters can be successful in life. Lady Macbeth goes mad and commits suicide because she can't handle the corrupting influence of power. We see Desdemona as a determined, confident character who's gradually changed by her marriage and by the violence that's enacted upon her, and she ultimately dies. Emilia, who becomes more confident throughout Othello, dies as well. The only female character who survives the play is Bianca, who is someone who's prepared to be submissive sometimes, but confident when she needs to be. So we could question whether Shakespeare's saying, actually, very strong female characters can't survive in this particular world. You need to have a balance of the different qualities and to know how to play the patriarchal system in order to be able to get through life. Anyway, going back to the text we have in front of us, she's relentlessly asking Othello when he's going to meet Cassio. So tomorrow night or Tuesday morn, on Tuesday noon or night, or Wednesday morn. So this is definitely talking Othello out of patience. She's insisting that he's going to meet Cassio as soon as possible. Okay, Emilia then doesn't say much in this scene. She is on stage at the start, but as in earlier scenes, she's relatively silenced by the milieu that she's in. So, for example, at the start of Act 2, where Iago insults her, Desdemona responds to Iago, but Emilia doesn't say very much. Emilia seems very submissive to Iago, and also completely duped. She seems to be so in love with him that she doesn't realise what he's trying to do. And she says in Act 3, I warrant it grieves my husband, as if the cause were his. And what she means by this is, I warrant, I think, that Cassio's demotion makes my husband upset, as if it were himself who had been demoted. So she seems either very much in thrall of Iago and very much duped by him and believing in his facade, his persona, or she wants to play along with that and she knows what she's doing, but she's prepared to help him in his plan. Now, given her reactions later on in the play, I think it's probably the former. I think she is probably duped by Iago at this point. Iago then is opportunistic in this scene. He takes opportunities as they present themselves. So, for example, when he says, "Ha, I like not that," when he sees Cassio slip away. He's also very subtle and intelligent, which is a Machiavellian trait. He says that Cassio moves guilty-like, which is really interesting. He doesn't say that Cassio is guilty, but he says that it could be interpreted in that way. So, as we've seen in previous scenes, Iago is actually unsettlingly honest. And no one can say that he's a villain because he's not lying. He's just giving his interpretation of what happens. Later in the scene he asks, "Did Michael Cassio, when you wooed my lady, know of your love?" Again, it's not a direct allegation against Cassio. He's just suggesting an idea to Othello. He's saying to Othello, did Cassio know Desdemona for a long time, or has he just met her on Cyprus? The answer, of course, is that Cassio knew Desdemona all the way through Othello's visits to the house, and Cassio often carried love letters between Othello and Desdemona. So Cassio has potentially had more contact with Desdemona than Othello has. So again, this is planting the seed of doubt in Othello's mind. Iago pretends to be reluctant to share his thoughts with Othello. Othello really has to push Iago to say what he means in this scene. Really what we see here is Iago as the puppet master. He's stage managing Othello's reactions to things. And we see this when Iago says, "Oft my jealousy shapes thoughts that are not." So very often my jealousy about Emilia, we suggest, creates thoughts in my mind that aren't real. And this is what he's trying to prompt Othello to do. He's trying to prompt Othello's jealousy to create ideas in his head that aren't accurate. And then we've got a facade of thoughtfulness for Othello as well. He says, "Beware, my lord, of jealousy." So he's pretending to warn Othello against jealousy when actually that's the very thing that he's trying to create. Okay, let's look at a few quotations then from this scene that we can take away with us. So this one here is from Othello. He says, "Excellent wretch, perdition catch my soul, but I do love thee, and when I love thee not, chaos is come again." So the word wretch may at the time have been a term of endearment. However, and particularly in modern adaptations of the play, this would be an insult suggesting a poor creature. So it seems that Othello could potentially be quite angry at this point. Perdition means destruction or damnation, being sent to hell. So essentially hell will take my soul, but I do love thee anyway. And when I love thee not, well, he means here when I don't love you anymore, chaos has come again. So excellent wretch then. Well, this phrase is often performed with a sudden change of tone as Othello transforms from the subdued but loving husband to suspicious and jealous. The adjective excellent we would think is quite a positive word. However, here it emphasises his growing disgust and anger. It's also a departure from the eloquence we saw earlier in the play. So you'll remember that earlier he says, "Rude am I in my speech." However, he's a very accomplished speaker in Act 1. His blank verse is very well crafted, his choice of words is extremely intelligent, and he's able to use a whole range of imagery in Act 1. Whereas what we see here in Act 3 is that language starts to break down, and he becomes increasingly a less eloquent speaker as the madness takes hold. Looking at perdition then, so whereas elsewhere in the play Othello alludes to heaven, here the reference to hell consolidates our perception that he's on a destructive trajectory. So it also confirms his growing closeness to Iago, because it's Iago who talks about hell and night. It's Iago who's associated with the idea of hell and destruction and death and damnation. For the Jacobean audience, hell would connote absolute destruction and despair, as well as darkness and suffering. So Othello's reference to this emphasises the growing depths of his unhappiness in his marriage. Looking at the phrase my soul, this is reminiscent of Act 1 when Othello speaks of his perfect soul, which we talked about previously as a potentially hubristic statement. But the repetition of this word in this new destructive context underlines the transformation in his character from an articulate, loving husband to a potentially violent and vengeful figure. However, whilst it also may appear that Shakespeare is drawing Othello closer to the racist stereotype of the time, so Othello's becoming more violent, he's becoming less rational, he is becoming less obsessed with law and order, he's becoming a worse leader of men, so in that way he seems to be a more stereotypical character. What is notable here is that it's Iago, the white character, who is the corrupting force that's driving him to his doom. So we see Othello really as the victim, and Iago is shaping him into that stereotype. Looking at the word chaos then, the reference to this is significant, as now we see Othello's mind and his marriage teetering on the brink of collapse. So due to Othello's role as governor of Cyprus, this is going to have a wider impact on society, showing that the role of a leader is crucial in maintaining order. So could this be a message for the political leaders of Shakespeare's world? If you remember the potential political chaos that was caused by Elizabeth I's personal decision not to marry. So Elizabeth I didn't marry, she didn't have any children, and therefore on her death the question was who's going to inherit the throne. Now James the Sixth of Scotland, the first of England, did take over in a bloodless way. However, it was potentially a very sensitive situation which could have plunged the country into war. So is Shakespeare asserting that successful leaders need to maintain equilibrium in their personal lives in order to maintain the political state? We also see here, just a side note, that the iambic pentameter is starting to crumble, so there's repeated use of enjambment as Othello approaches closer to using prose than blank verse. Okay, another key quotation then is again from Othello, and he says, "By heaven, thou echoest me, as if there were some monster in thy thought, too hideous to be shown." So what he's saying is that Othello means Iago is echoing his words. So earlier in the scene, Othello has said, "Is he honest?" And Iago says, "Honest, my lord." And then Othello says, "Thinkst thou that he's honest?" And Iago says, "Thinks, my lord." So Iago is echoing, repeating Othello's words back to him. What we see here is that Othello's revealing his naivety and his blindness, because actually it's him who's echoing Iago, not the other way around. It's Othello who's starting to pick up Iago's words. It's Othello who's starting to swear and say things like zounds, which is a word we associate more with Iago. So it's not Iago that's echoing Othello, it's Othello who's echoing Iago. And what we call this in a kind of linguistic theory, in accommodation theory, is convergence. And that means that people's speech patterns are converging, they're becoming more similar to the people that they're emotionally close to. So, for example, your speech patterns will converge with your family or with someone that you're going out with. And we see this happening increasingly with Othello as the play approaches its climax. What we've also got in this quotation is monstrous imagery, which is associated with the loss of rational thought and increasingly destructive behaviour. This is a product of emotional anguish, but it is also associated with ideas of immorality, which is due to the Renaissance iconography of monsters appearing in hell. So Iago mentions the green-eyed monster of jealousy later in the scene, whilst in Act 4, Othello says that a horned man's a monster and a beast. And of course we will remember that Iago comments on the monstrous birth of his own plan in Act 1. So this is becoming a motif throughout the play, this idea of something hideous that's being created by the mind of man. Ironically, Othello says that the monster is in Iago's thought. So he says thy thought, when actually it's Iago that's creating this monster in Othello's mind. And the monster may symbolise the idea of an uncontrollable, almost supernatural being who will grow in strength, and there's also a sense of unnaturalness in this. And in this scene, as I've mentioned earlier, Othello is very concerned with what can be shown and seen and proved, and later he insists that he wants ocular proof of Desdemona's infidelity, which Iago then provides him in the form of a handkerchief. So overall, what is the function of this scene? Well, it's a turning point in the play. Othello's anger and frustration is directed at the absent Desdemona for the first time. Iago directs Othello's thoughts towards a debased, all-consuming jealousy. We see a descent into chaos in this scene. The seeds of jealousy are irrevocably sown, and Iago, who now has power over Rodrigo, Emilia and Cassio, secures his dominance over Othello as well. The scene also reinforces Desdemona's position as an innocent, naive, tragic victim. So she's very unwittingly making trouble for herself in this scene, and she doesn't seem to understand that everything that she says is only making the situation worse. This could be because she's been somewhat sequestered from society in Venice, as would have been the custom of the day, and she hasn't been out in society much in an independent way, so she doesn't know the conventions, or she doesn't know how people will judge her. The scene also emphasises Othello's flaws, so his blindness, his lack of self-knowledge and understanding, his naive openness about the relationship, his readiness to trust the wrong people, and therefore his lack of character judgment. And Shakespeare is revealing the disastrous consequences for the personal and political world if a leader lacks these traits. And finally, it reinforces the problematic nature of truth. So how can an individual discern what is true or false? What is the significance of hard evidence? And obviously this is very timely in terms of the idea of fake news in today's society. Obviously, when you write your essays on Othello, you need to consider different aspects of tragedy, and I've picked out the key ones here that apply to this scene. So isolation, we see Othello's increasing isolation from Desdemona, and therefore the impact that deception can have on the human condition. As he becomes more and more isolated, his mental health becomes worse, and we see the fragility of his psychological state. Another key aspect is that of the tragic hero, and as I've just mentioned on the previous slide, we really see his hamartia, his fatal flaws, being exposed in this scene. We also see power in the sense that Iago is asserting his power and dominance over other people, and he's reducing Othello's power. We also see the power of women could be relevant, and that links in with the treatment of women as well, how women can be presented as being very dominant, very in charge, but that can potentially lead to their downfall as well. We see a blindness in terms of Othello, Cassio, Emilia and Desdemona are all blind to what Iago is doing. And we get a sense of waste as well, because what we have in the play is a marriage that could be a symbol of breaking the barriers between different races, different social classes. We see the potential that Othello has to rise through this meritocracy and to really challenge social conventions. And that's a real waste of human potential as we get towards the end of the play. Okay, so sorry to leave it on that slightly depressing note. I hope you filled in your Cornell note-taking sheet. Make sure you look at the keywords and you do your summary as well. And it's not quite at the end of the scene, we're only halfway through, but I'll do another video on the second half of the scene.